So I think we might make a start. There'll be a few people still joining us in the background. But thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today for our ADIA Meetup on mental health and digital inclusion. I know that it's a topic that everybody's really been looking forward to discussing today. My name's David Spriggs. I'm the CEO of Info Exchange and the chair of the Australian Digital Inclusion Alliance, and my role is as a moderator of today's meetup. And before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land that we're all joining from today. I'm normally on Wurundjeri country, but today I'm on the lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And would encourage you just to take a moment to think about the land that you're joining from today. And please, if you'd like, pop the country you're joining from today into the chat window, as has often been custom on these Zoom webinars. And I think probably also just today to acknowledge that last week we had Close the Gap Day, and was bringing vital attention to the issue of mental health in Indigenous communities, really relevant to our discussion today. So if you haven't joined one of our meetups before, just quickly about the Australian Digital Inclusion Alliance. The ADIA is a shared initiative, over 500 business, government, academic and community organisations really coming together to work together to address the issue of digital inclusion. The ADIA is supported by Info Exchange, Google and Telstra, and we acknowledge Australia Post as a founding partner of the Australian Digital Inclusion Alliance, which was formed following the National Year of Digital Inclusion back in 2016. Our vision at the ADIA is to reduce the digital divide, which is really all about enabling social and economic participation for everyone in Australia. And we used to have to spend some time talking about the issue of digital inclusion, but I think particularly over the last 12 months, in the context of COVID, digital inclusion has really become a mainstream issue across Australia. As part of that, in October of last year, the ADIA, with the support of our members, put together a national digital inclusion roadmap, outlining what we think collectively should be done to address digital inclusion as an issue in Australia. And if you haven't had a chance to have a look at that roadmap, I'd encourage you to go to the ADIA website. It's digitalinclusion.org.au and have a look at that roadmap. But we've been really pleased at the response from across the community to the roadmap, and particularly strong support from the federal government, from the Digital Technologies Task Force in Prime Minister and Cabinet, and more recently from Minister for the Digital Economy, Senator Jane Hume, and excited about some initiatives which may be announced in the upcoming budget in relation to digital inclusion. But moving on to today's topic is all about mental health and digital inclusion. And some fantastic speakers joining us who are going to talk about some of the research that's been conducted on mental health and digital inclusion, talk about some of the stigma that's often associated with complex mental health problems and some of the barriers that creates to participation in a digital society, and then talk about safety and wellbeing, and particularly taking a strengths-based approach to that, looking at building strength and resilience across community. I'm delighted to be joined by three speakers today. And we've got Anthony McCosker, who's the Associate Professor of Media and Communications at Swinburne University, Dr. Michelle Blanchard, who's the Deputy CEO at SANE Australia, and we've got Professor Jane Burns from the University of Melbourne. And Jane's been really kind to fit us into her schedule today, and is currently at the airport. So please understand if there's a bit of camera on and off, and maybe some boarding announcements going on in the background. But really a huge thank you to Anthony, Michelle and Jane for joining us today. A few bits of housekeeping. Firstly, this session is being recorded. In terms of Q&A, we're going to ask each speaker to speak for about 10 minutes. And then after each speaker, have a short period for Q&A, and then we'll come back at the end and have a longer Q&A session with all of our speakers. but really encourage you to keep this interactive as we've done in previous ADIA meetups. And please enter comments as we go into the chat, and please enter questions as we go into the little Q&A button that's at the bottom of the screen there. Please enter those questions as we go, and then we can, as I say, we can pause after each speaker, have a few questions, and then come back to a series of group questions at the end. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us. And I'd now like to introduce our first speaker for the day, and delighted to introduce somebody who's worked in this space for a long time. Anthony McCosker is the Associate Professor of Media and Communications and the Deputy Director of Swinburne University's Social Innovation Research Institute. He researches the impact and uses of social media, data and new communications technologies with a focus on mental health, digital citizenship, inclusion and literacy, and would be well known to so many people on this call for being such a strong advocate and researcher in the digital inclusion space. So please join me in welcome Anthony. Over to you, Anthony.
Thanks, David. And yeah, thanks for the introduction, and thanks to Anna and Ishta for organising the panel as well. It's a really good topic to be talking about at the moment, I think. So yes, over the last 6 or 7 years or so, I've been working with organisations like SANE, Australia Beyond Blue, more recently Reach Out and others, trying to understand the role of that online mental health plays in the service ecosystem and for health consumers, and for broadening health participation, I'd say. And at the same time, I've been doing a lot of work around digital inclusion and participation, particularly among older Australians, through commissioned work with Department of Social Services, eSafety, Good Things Foundation, and particularly evaluating the Be Connected program. So this is a really good chance to think about some of the key issues at the intersection of mental health and digital inclusion. What I find really interesting in the research space is that these things aren't usually studied and understood together, and at the same time there's a common sense element to the way that we think about problems associated with both of these spaces. So I just want to talk about a few things today, and I want to emphasize concern as a perfect example of the connection issue. My connection is very unstable today, so please bear with me. So I just want to emphasize the consistent concern that comes up in discussions with health consumers, mental health consumers, and with service providers. And it's this issue of precarious connection, exactly the thing that we all experience, I think. But whether we're talking about online forums, clinical telehealth consultations, or social media, where mental health is discussed and supported, I've seen this consistent issue of connection being fragile and easily broken. And that's about the technical connection, it's about the social connection, but also the client service provider connection in mental health space. And of course, we know that the consequences of disconnection and isolation are huge for those who are already marginalized or socially excluded and disadvantaged. And at the same time, we're seeing this rapid change in the way that we connect to others and to services, particularly in what we call the digital by default society that we're increasingly involved in. So we know from the important work of the Australian Digital Inclusion Index and decades of research that digital exclusion is associated with a range of social factors that align quite closely with those of mental health issues as well. So low socioeconomic advantage, low education, unemployment, along with mobile-only internet access, which tends to be a kind of indicator of lower digital inclusion as well. But at the same time, there aren't any universal indicators or measures of the problem of mental health and digital inclusion and exclusion. And health consumers, as we also probably know, can be among the most innovative technology users and internet users, they're often the first adopters of the interesting new technology and tools for accessing health information and support. But sometimes this abundance of apps and groups and connection for health participation masks the underlying and persistent problem of disconnection. Any health service provider or clinician will have a story to tell about them. You know, home broadband is just not always up to scratch. A single console might move between, you know, Google Meet, Zoom, Teams, mobile phone, just to try to get some sort of connection. There's the issue of eye contact, of reading emotions, and all of those issues that we hear about from clinicians. But there's also technical issues around software systems for health records, privacy, security, which isn't always great when it leaves the clinic. And a car consultation seems to be the only real workaround for privacy and dealing with discretion in terms of mental health. In that space, our work with in our work with SANE, we've been looking at connection through online forums across rural and remote Australia, and trying to identify the resilience building work that's happening there. We see so much evidence of the relationship between isolation, service gaps, and deepening mental health issues. And, you know, particularly those that follow broken relationships. So there's this kind of really important entwining of the digital, technical, and social aspects of connection. That work has kind of emphasized the importance of that connection, and also being able to reach beyond the immediate context, social context of family, and immediate community in receiving support. In the work with Beyond Blue on suicidal thoughts and self-harms, and this is an area where you know, we don't often go online in public spaces, but a key takeaway from that research was the work that's involved in encouraging people who are in deep distress to come back, to keeping people there, to keeping them engaged over time. And it's a really difficult process for those who are involved in those forums. We know it's a kind of community effort, and it's always threatened by this, again, precarious connection that's there. There's no single app or web tool or platform that solves this issue of connection properly. And in our digital research and platform research, we kind of understand the fact that platforms introduce forms of disconnection as well that are really important to understand. Just lastly, social connection and isolation and loneliness are key issues across the population, and it's certainly something that has been a focus of our research with older Australians. So in the work with Department of Social Services looking at the Be Connected program, there were some standout findings around the link between wellbeing and digital connection that I think is really, it needs to be teased out a little bit more. We saw that participation in Be Connected in the program and in working towards improving digital skills for older people was directly correlated with improved or reduced loneliness. So improved social connection, but specifically reduced loneliness. People with digital confidence was also significantly higher for those with better physical and emotional health, and vice versa, those who were less confident with digital technologies felt lonelier. So we could see these patterns at quite a wide population level, and it kind of confirms what we know about social connection, particularly connecting with friends and family being a key motivator for improving digital skills. I won't say much more other than to say that we'll make inroads into these issues, I think, when we address digital inclusion and mental health and wellbeing simultaneously together. There's a lot of good programs bringing these elements together, and we can talk about a few, and I'll throw to Michelle, who I'm sure will be able to talk about what SANE's doing as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anthony. I think such a good point about integrating these different pieces together. So I encourage people. We've got time for a couple of questions for Anthony, and then, as I say, we'll come back for Q&A at the later on. If you've got questions, please click the Q&A button at the bottom, and you can put in your question. And just a reminder, if you're using the chat function, to please select all panelists and attendees when you're sending chat messages, rather than sending them to individuals. That way they get shared with the group. But there's one question for you here, Anthony, from Steve, and it's around the Australian Digital Inclusion Index, which I know you know well, and we were just speaking to earlier. I'm just asking whether some of those metrics have lost their relevance, and particularly talking about the example of his own wife, who is a mobile-only user and ends up getting a low digital inclusion index score, but is actually really well connected with a whole lot of groups and different apps and connections, and, as he says, unquestionably fitter, healthier, and more socially engaged than a perfectly included overweight child with a score of 100. So I don't know if you want to comment on the ADIA and potentially what more could be incorporated in the index from a mental health perspective.
Yeah, thanks. It's a really good question, because the ADIA, as we know, is it's an index, it's a score, and sometimes they're very blunt. So I'll just say that the research that we've been doing has really been about understanding that diversity, particularly in older Australians, and there's huge difference between people in the age bracket of 50 to 64, 5, who are in and out of work, but haven't necessarily had the exposure to digital technology throughout their working career. A big difference between those people and those who grew up, working with computers in their work for very specific purposes, but as they've moved further into retirement, have lost confidence, lost access, lost touch. We certainly see three kind of core groups. A group who are emerging, who are really trying to learn new digital skills. A group who are somewhere in the middle, have had good access, have had good skills, good access through work, but have started to lose touch with newer technologies and platforms. And then accomplished learners, who could be right into their 90s, connecting to poetry groups online and doing all sorts of things. So that diversity is really important. But I do think that the measures in the index around access, affordability, and ability are really important. And we do need to have some ongoing measures that we kind of maintain and stick to.
Fantastic. Thanks, Anthony. And there's another question from Lauren from Leap NGO. And she's asking, can you share any broader research that might be out there beyond the Be Connected evaluation that talks about this issue of connection and isolation, particularly for older people?
Yeah, look, there is a huge amount of research, particularly around or coming from the perspective of loneliness. There's a lot less coming from the perspective that my teams kind of really prefer, which is around social connection. And so there is a huge amount around loneliness. And if you look at any of the research databases, I'm happy to share offline with you guys at Leap some of that work, and try to pull out some of the key stuff that's really about understanding social connection better, and the drivers and the levers of social connection, particularly in older age.
Fantastic, thanks, Anthony. And maybe we can send some of those resources out when we send out a recap of this session and send the recording of this session out. So, thank you very much, Anthony, for joining us. was really, really valuable, and look forward to you joining us for the Q&A after our speakers. Encourage everybody to keep putting in, using the chat function, and keep asking questions as we go. I'm delighted to next introduce Dr. Michelle Blanchard. Dr. Michelle Blanchard is the Deputy CEO at SANE Australia. Michelle is also the Founding Director of SANE's Anne Deveson Research Centre, which partners with people with mental illness and their family, friends and colleagues to drive policy and social change. Michelle is also an Honorary Senior Fellow in the School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne. And Michelle has taken time out of her busy day to join us, not from Melbourne, but from Sydney today. So thank you very much, Michelle, for joining us.
Thanks so much, David. And I'm joining you today from Gadigal land and Bondi, to be precise, which I learned earlier this week actually means water breaking over rocks. And there certainly was a lot of it around here earlier in the week. In our work at SANE, we try and make a difference through delivering support services through advocacy and research for people who might be affected by complex mental health issues. And for those for whom this language isn't as familiar, they're things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, personality disorder, as well as trauma and distress. So we talk about mental health issues to be inclusive of those who might identify with diagnostic labels, but also those who don't. Our organisation was established about 35 years ago by two pretty remarkable women, Anne Deveson and Marg Leggett. Marg remains to this day a really formidable advocate. Anne sadly passed away a couple of years ago, but her legacy is really having opened up the public conversation about mental illness in Australia. And so eliminating stigma and discrimination and promoting inclusion and participation have really been part of SANE's DNA right from the beginning. So in talking about digital inclusion, there were three things that I wanted to speak about today. The first one was around the importance of access to devices and digital supports, and Anthony's spoken a little bit about that already. The second was around design that meets people's needs. And the third one is around creating online environments that are safe, supportive, and free from stigma and discrimination. And in kind of speaking to each of these issues, I wanted to be really clear, there's no stereotypical person who experiences a mental health issue. You know, for every person who might be experiencing some of the barriers that I'm going to talk about, there may be someone with a complex mental health issue who's developing an online social enterprise and is incredibly connected and digitally included. That's the thing about mental illness, is that it doesn't discriminate. But once you experience some of these issues, unfortunately, it's more likely that you might encounter some form of discrimination. So on a really practical level, you know, we know that there are enormous benefits to being digitally connected, but there are still a small proportion of people who have no or low access to devices. For people with complex mental health issues, this plays out because Australia has one of the lowest employment rates in the OECD for people who might be living with severe mental illness or disability. And people who experience mental illness are more likely to live below the poverty line. So that certainly can affect people's capacity to purchase or maintain a device, pay for data, those sorts of things. But there are also some broader issues around access. And unfortunately, concerns about safety have really meant that sometimes when people are receiving treatment in places like residential or inpatient settings, they have their devices confiscated at the door. And this is something I found when I did my PhD with Jane a decade ago. And it still really puzzles me about why this is the case when there is such a strong case for being digitally connected and included, particularly at those times when people might be experiencing vulnerability and disconnection. There are obvious issues around economic insecurity and living arrangements. People might be sharing access to a device. You know, for some people during COVID, telehealth was a really wonderful development. It made connecting with health professionals and peers a lot easier. But if your living environment is unstable, if it's chaotic, if there's not a lot of privacy, that can be a real challenge. And so we really need to be thinking about this when we're designing digital mental health support. So it's about thinking about options that might be low bandwidth, don't rely on the latest and greatest hardware, but we also need to be thinking about issues like privacy. So can the open window or app be easily hidden if the environment's not safe for the person to be accessing support in? Can video be opted out if people are feeling conscious about their bodies? Can video clips have subtitles in them, not just for people who may have hearing impairments, but in case the video is something that people don't want overheard by others who might be in the same space? We need to really start to think about the look, the feel and the functionality of tools to make sure that they meet people's needs. When someone is in enormous distress or they're experiencing cognitive dysfunction, lots of text, long videos, busy designs, that can all be really overwhelming. So we need to think really carefully about what might be going on for people when they're accessing these kinds of support. There's also a small group of people for whom these kinds of supports might exacerbate some of the distress they're experiencing. Setting aside the very real cybersecurity risks, if you think for a moment, if you were somebody who experiences psychosis and part of your psychosis is that you think the television or the computer is surveilling you, you're going to be far less likely to engage with some of these online supports when you're really unwell. And I think what that's meant from a research and a service development perspective is that people have often avoided designing things for people with these more complex mental health issues. They're focused on anxiety and depression in particular. And I think it's really important that we start to look at the kinds of really clever and smart interventions that can be developed for people who might be experiencing more complex conditions, and building those in partnership with people who have these experiences is incredibly important. So the final issue that I wanted to talk about today was stigma and discrimination. And about 20 years ago, Australia launched Beyond Blue, and Jane will remember this being one of the key leaders in establishing Beyond Blue. There were really big investments made in destigmatising anxiety and depression. And when I joined SANE a couple of years ago, I was given a bit of a challenge. So what we were seeing was that community attitudes towards people affected by mental illness were changing. Beyond Blue had made a difference. But for people who experienced things like schizophrenia, stigma was still the number one concern. So for the last couple of years, we've been working with the Melbourne School of Psych Sciences and the Paul Ramsay Foundation to develop the National Stigma Report Card. We surveyed just under 2,000 people. We did it online, in person, in communities and via telephone until the pandemic meant that was a bit limited. But we talked to people about their experiences across 14 different life domains. We spoke to people right across the country. The youngest participant was 18 and the eldest was 86. And what they told us about their experiences was pretty harrowing. So of the 14 life domains we looked at, social media and the online environment was the fourth most common environment where people felt they were most impacted by stigma and discrimination. The only ones that were higher were interpersonal relationships, employment and healthcare. 88% of our participants on average said that they had read or heard content online that portrayed people living with mental illness as dangerous, unsafe, unpredictable, incapable of recovery, all of the horrible stereotypes and untruths that we hear about these experiences. People had withdrawn from social media, they filtered the information that they shared, but they also withdrew from those environments so that they weren't affected by the impact. Where people did talk about positive experiences, they were very much about closed communities like the one that we've developed at SANE through the SANE forums, or private social media groups on Facebook and other platforms where they knew who was there and they knew they'd be safe. So this kind of fear of being stigmatised or discriminated against really forces people to step back from the places where they should feel the safest. So I think there's a really big opportunity for us to make sure that online communities and environments are really safe, inclusive and respectful of those who experience these more complex mental health conditions. We've made a bunch of recommendations in our report card, and you can access that on our website at nationalstigmareportcard.com.au. But my biggest takeaway from this work, and I'll kind of end on this, has been a bit of a shift in how we think about reducing stigma and discrimination and promoting inclusion. We've focused a lot on public awareness campaigns and changing people's attitudes. But for me, if we're actually serious about reducing stigma and discrimination, we actually need to not only amplify the stories of people living with complex mental health issues to build that empathy and understanding, but also make some really more systemic changes, like addressing inequitable funding and providing access to income support, safe and secure housing. So it's only if we address these issues that we'll be able to promote inclusion, whether that's online or offline. So thanks again for the opportunity to be part of today, and looking forward to being part of the conversation.
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle. And again, encourage everybody to please enter questions into the Q&A or any comments into the chat. There's a question here for you, Michelle, talking about some of the mental health apps and taking into account individuals from culturally and linguistically diverse communities, and how you might be able to incorporate some of the specific challenges for people from these communities, you know, in the online space and into those apps.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think with any of these tools, it's going to be difficult to create something that will meet everybody's needs. And the best way to really ensure that things are effective, though, is to do that in partnership with the community that's looking to benefit. So that needs to be targeted user experience research and co-creation with people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds and from other communities who might be using these services. There's a really interesting challenge, though. We'd sort of heard from some of the folks that are involved in the Embrace multicultural mental health initiative that for some people, connecting with people who share the same culture is really important. But for other people, it's actually that anonymity in a larger community that is inclusive and safe that's most beneficial for them. So I think those partnerships are incredibly important.
Fantastic, thank you. And that was, yeah, I mean, the real takeaway I took from your talk then around that, yeah, working in partnership with people with lived experience and that sort of the look and feel and design of a lot of the applications. There's a comment in the chat and a question. I'll try and bring them together a little bit, talking about the issue of social isolation and then digital isolation, and you know, it can be a bit chicken and egg how you address one without the other. And also kind of talking about some of the online resources and the approach you were talking about. Do you see a need for access outside? Is this a separate outside piece, or is this done in conjunction with community-based resources and community-based services?
Yeah, that's a really big question. But I think none of this happens in isolation. So in thinking about mental health, it's one of those issues that impacts every facet of a person's life. So taking a systems approach is really important. I think there's enormous opportunities to embed some of these digital supports in local, place-based, face-to-face support in people's interactions with their health professionals, not as a replacement for, but as something that actually strengthens and creates a community around the individual.
Fantastic, thank you so much. And there was one final piece. There's been a couple of comments in the chat around, yes, kind of the strength and the capability of some of the mental health resources online and some of the apps, but also, you know, the problems that can contribute to mental health issues. And you know, sometimes a lot of these online resources no filter and can be very triggering. Whether you've got any comments about that?
Yeah, absolutely agree. And you know, if we just take even the last 2 weeks into account, and that there is a relationship sometimes between people's experience of trauma and abuse and their experience of a mental health problem. And we've had a number of people who have reached out to us for support, feeling like they really can't be online at the moment because so much of that conversation is overwhelming for them or bringing up a whole range of issues. So, you know, the online environment is, you know, an extension of the rest of the community. And so, you know, I think actually addressing some of these bigger picture societal issues and inequities is really critical if we're also going to support people to feel connected online.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much, Michelle. And Michelle's going to stay with us as well for the Q&A at the end of the session. But thank you again so much, Michelle. So next I'm going to introduce Professor Jane Burns. As we mentioned before, Jane's joining us from the airport. So please forgive us for any connection issues or for any audio issues. And Jane really needs no introduction, is very well known across the sector. Professor Jane Burns has 2 decades of experience in mental health and suicide prevention with a passion for digital health solutions and the profit for purpose sector. And she's joining us today in her capacity as an enterprise professor at the University of Melbourne. Thank you so much for joining us, Jane.
Thanks, David. Thanks so much. And I do hope that we don't get much disturbance. It's a very busy lounge, so it's clear that we're going back to some sort of post-COVID normal. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, elders past, present and future. Thank again, Ishta and Anna and ADIA for the opportunity to come on and have a chat to yourself and to Michelle and Anthony. Michelle and I have a 20-year history of working together, which is clearly Michelle was a baby when we started working together and I was a teenager. But it makes me feel so old when I think about how much innovation there has been in technology around mental health and wellbeing. And I want to just reflect on that as both a professional who's worked in the space around suicide prevention, but also now as a mum to 3 kids, Angus, Holly and Harry. And for those of you who don't know, Angus, my eldest, lives with Down syndrome, autism and is non-verbal. So I used to back in the day say, you know, for the first time in history, we have the opportunity to reach through the use of tech our most vulnerable populations. And I truly believed that. And then suddenly I found myself with a child whose only means of connection and communication is through his iPad. And that's an incredible experience to try to get your head around and to try to understand how he is navigating the digital world. And as Michelle and I used to like to say, you know, the online and the offline collide, and it's not this, you know, there's an online world and there's an offline world. It's this is people's world and it is their reality. And so I was reflecting and having a chat to Ishta when she called me to pop onto the panel around, you know, the COVID-19, the pandemic, and suddenly everyone was saying, you know, it's an amazing thing, this technology, and it's disrupted the way in which we provide services. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, wow, Jack Heath and Jono back in 1997 introduced to Australia reachout.com, which was the world's first online network supporting young people living in rural, regional and remote communities. And so we're 23, 24 years on. And this is not new. And, so, you know, suddenly people are sort of saying, well, you know, COVID-19's changed everything. I think it's threw into stark reality. We didn't have choice in this and we had to use the technologies. But I'd make the point that, and I think Michelle did this well, you know, telephony is not smart technology, and just getting on a Zoom call and being able to speak to a clinician, again, is not innovation. So I do hope that with the ongoing conversations about inclusion and diversity and how we actually use technologies, we start to think a little more creatively about what it actually means to support people's mental health, and not just their mental health, but their well-being. So how do we stay well in a digitally connected world? So I'm going to talk about 3 things, and as you guys all know, I talk a lot. So David, you're going to have to jump in and shut me up if I go over time. But first of all, I wanted to talk about technology and the different types of technologies, and what I've seen over the last 23 years and some of the incredible innovations that and research that's been done that I think we've not been great at putting into practice. So our implementation is not fabulous, but it can be, and it can get better. And I think, you know, we have an opportunity to do that. So I'll cover that first. Second, I want to really challenge some of the misconceptions, and Michelle's PhD was brilliant in, shining a light on where there were disparities in access, but also the real disconnect between the ways in which younger people use technologies versus the way professionals use technologies and the way they're set up within service offerings. There's a few examples there. And then finally, I really do want to chat about innovation to watch. And everyone talks about big data and the Internet of Things, but I think increasingly as we start to see the technologies get smarter, get better, we do have an opportunity to really change the dial up on how we actually innovate and what it means to create not a one-size-fits-all service, because that's just not a reality, but how we actually curate, collate and customise to the needs of people. So if I kick off with the tech, and I mentioned Jack Heath. I think, Jack was a million miles ahead of his time with the startup of Reach Out, and he somehow convinced Michael Rennie and others to invest in him, Microsoft back in the day, to set out the Reach Out platform. And, again, Jono was, just out of an honours degree, but it was co-design at its very, very, very best. Young people at the core of it, at the heart of it. Many of the youth ambassadors that came out of Reach Out have now gone on to work in mental health, including, Michelle. You think about designing for purpose and fit for purpose, and co-design is not new. Reach Out did it 20 plus years ago. We embedded it in the work that we did for Young and Well CRC, and increasingly you're seeing it as, if you're going to design, you have to design with the people who are going to use the service. There's no point in designing if you don't actually consult with your client base or your participant base. And I think, Anthony talks a lot about social networks and online networks. Again, the power of being able to connect through the online networks. Again, reflection during COVID-19 and being stuck in Melbourne in lockdown, and family over in South Australia. I fell over in the middle of it and fractured my shoulder. Mum had a massive heart attack and almost died. We're on the iPad talking to her as she was going into ICU with my 3 kids, and Angus is non-verbal, and he could see it was grandma, and he was able to connect with grandma and vice versa. And you sort of think about the power of that connection and the utilisation of those connections. Now, that's not to say that people don't find technologies disconnecting, because they do, but we've got to get the balance right between connection and disconnection, and how we actually support people to be more connected. I think back to one of the very, very first original projects that we did with Google when Ishta was at Google, and Amanda Third and Pip Collins, both absolute gurus and guns in cyber safety. And we set up a living laboratory, had young people talking to adults about how they navigated the online world and kept themselves safe. And, essentially back then, that's 11 years ago, we were saying, if we have these conversations about how, as you move through childhood into adolescence, into early adulthood, and then into adulthood, and then across into the intergenerational, we've got to be smarter at having conversations. And I feel that we've gone a little backwards in that space. And again, when I get to my innovation, I'll talk about how I think we can potentially use artificial intelligence to get kids and parents having better conversations about cyber safety, rather than put in parental controls and everything will be solved, because we know that kids are smart and they know how to get around that. To assistive tech and gaming, and again, one of my favourite projects out of Young and Well was led by the Victoria University guys. They set up a living lab for children and young people with autism, and essentially said to them, here's a computer, come in I think once a week for 2 or 3 hours and learn to code. And these children and young people learnt to code, and they made these games. But what was the most important about that was not the game that they were making, but the social connections that they were forming. And I remember we had this little boy, Bailey, who was absolutely obsessed with Mario Brothers. He came in and presented with his mum to the Young and Well board. And it was a pretty full-on board. Mark Mentha was the chair. He's from Quarter Mentha. And this little kid came in with his red hat on, and he presented this game, and no one knew what on earth it was, what it did or what it was about. But the thing that he finished on, that his mum finished on, was for the first time in his life, she had a sense that he was not going to move from the classroom to the bedroom and not have an opportunity to think about how he could be included through either social network with friends, but also the potential for a job for him. And Michelle makes the point around social determinants and structural barriers. And I think increasingly, if we're looking at how do we support those who are most vulnerable, one of the best ways we can do that is to find people jobs and to support them to work in those environments. So that to me was just a beautiful classic example of gaming for good and a means of connecting. Assistive tech, again, I've talked about the iPad for Angus, but increasingly anyone who works in the disability sector knows that technologies are creating opportunities for people to be connected in ways that they had never, ever, ever, ever imagined, from support to driving cars if you're multiple amputee, through to smart home environments that can actually keep you far more mentally healthy, fit and well. And again, we're not there yet, but there are pockets of innovation. And as I said, I'll talk a little bit when I get to my third issue on where I think AI is going in that space as well. And then to virtual reality. And again, it's people are sort of saying, well, you know, what does this actually look like? And I've seen a few examples where it's been used in autism to support conversations, to help people understand how people might be feeling. I know out of Uni Sid, they were doing some work around mental illness, to Michelle's point, around VR goggles to identify what it felt like to be blind. So I think there's some really interesting, amazing work, but it doesn't happen in isolation, and it shouldn't happen in isolation. So the biggest potential benefit, I think, is these innovation ecosystems that actually bring the tech together. And we're not there yet in the mental health space, but I certainly think the opportunities from a digital perspective and the way the tech's moving is allowing us to think about these innovation ecosystems and the internet of things. So that's my first point. To the second point around misconceptions, and again, I'll do a bit of a historical because I think it's just worth us reflecting on those conversations. And again, Michelle was heavily involved in this research funded by Vic Health, Bridging the Digital Divide. And it was, you know, back in 2006, 7 and 8, I think we did it, I can't even remember. And we had beanbag centres set up across the country, which would literally labs where young people could come in and use technology who were vulnerable and didn't have access to technologies. And there are a lot of conversations about, you know, technology is not enabling for those who are vulnerable. Anyway, this research, and I won't go into the details of it, you can find the reports online. But one of the things that stood out for me was a conversation that a young woman had about, she was couch surfing, and she said, for me, my phone is the single most important item I've got, because it means I can connect via, this back in the day, MySpace, whoever remembers that, but it allows me to connect, and I feel safe in that space because I can put up my own creatives and make myself feel that I've actually got a safe environment to engage in. So I think, again, you know, the research that's come out of SANE around safe spaces and what that actually means, we need to get smarter at thinking about the internet as a setting. There was a question around multicultural and Indigenous, and again, to touch on the innovation back, Ernest Hunter was leading this, and it would be 2006, 7, 8 probably, literally in Indigenous communities setting up booths. They were called HitNet. I don't even know if they exist anymore, but again, co-designing content, psychoeducation materials to go onto these booths that were not web enabled, but actually were set up to provide this digital content to support Indigenous communities to better understand how they could look after their mental health and promote their wellbeing. So they're just two that I wanted to raise as an issue. Constantly back when we were doing Young and Well, people often talked about the online world as being separate to the offline world, and I think we've challenged that and continue to challenge that. There is, it is perverse and pervasive, and it's part and parcel of who we are and how we use it, which then brings me to my next and final point, which is the innovations that I think we should be watching. So if I kick off with the safety aspect of it, I do think there's, again, it's a new tech, Together AI, it's a startup. They're at early stage. They're looking at artificial intelligence to support families to have better conversations with their children, and as they develop, what those conversations might look like. And again, I sort of laugh about it because I think back to the day when we did the digital parenting book, and it was pretty progressive, and Google and Microsoft and Twitter and when they finally arrived in Oz and Facebook, that the companies were really working around how do we support people to be safe in these online environments, but also support parents to have those smart conversations. If I look at the mental health space in particular, smarter technologies that focus on wellbeing, again, artificial intelligence, there's a partnership happening at the moment between Swinburne University and again, a startup called Readiness. They're looking at how you build out curated content so that it actually is customized to the needs of the individual. So it's not a static website or an online forum, but it's actually customized to needs and matched up with a peer-to-peer support network, which then ties back into Anthony's conversations around online networks. Clever, again, they're applying the research into practical application. Smart algorithms, cyber clinics, a great example of how you marry up clinicians to technology so that you match the clinician to the person and the needs of the person. There's no point having a very, very complex, highly complex and working with a person if you've just come out of university. It just doesn't make sense. So how do you do that in a way that's respectful to both the lived experience and to the clinician, and support people to be better at doing their jobs and learn on as they go along? I think that's a really clever one. And to finish, because I'm so passionate about it and I'm sort of lending a hand on this one, the work that Liesl Yearsley is leading around Akin, which is an artificial intelligence that supports carers and people living with a disability to better utilise their time. So the things like getting up and out of bed and eating healthy food and managing diaries and booking professionals. She's at the moment beta testing this on an iPad. So we've got 10 families across Australia really looking at how could you build this out to better support people. So even if they are living with a disability or a complex psychosocial challenge, how do you support them to look after their wellbeing and build on their strengths and build on their capacities? So I'll finish up there. Hopefully it wasn't too noisy, and hand back to you.
Thank you so much, Jane. And no, the video and the audio was perfect, so we can do this from airline lounges. Thank you so much, and so much in that. And to answer one of your questions on HitNet is still going alive and very strong across Indigenous communities across the country. And Julie Gibson, who leads HitNet, has been a very active participant in the ADIA. Encourage everybody to keep putting into the chat and into the Q&A questions for both Jane, and then we'll also open it up to the whole panel for questions. Jane, there's a couple of questions in there. A quick one on what was the name of the parent-child discussion startup, but then also there's quite a few comments about artificial intelligence and young people working with AI as opposed to human-based counsellors, and the biases that come into AI models versus the biases that come into human-based counselling. And I know I heard the other day as part of our work, some of the co-design we were doing, younger people preferring to talk to what they know is an AI bot because a lower level of judgment than they might get from a human-based counsellor. But well, they just want to remind us of the name of the parent-child discussion startup, and then kind of comment more generally on AI.
Yep, so the cyber safety digital parenting is called Together AI, and they're beta testing at the moment, so you can join a closed social network via Facebook. And if people want to private message me, I'm happy to provide the link to that. I'll post it on LinkedIn post this. And the same with Akin, they're currently putting people onto their wait list to trial and test. Again, it's early stage startup, so really looking for lived experience to help them shape it out. And that's the only way really artificial intelligence works. It's not the technology, it's actually the people who are informing the technology, and it's empathic. They're looking closely now at what does it look like to actually create empathic tech. On the conversation around a real person versus, I've got two stories. One is Sal Bradford's PhD work, which I think was just absolutely stellar, and unfortunately it wasn't picked up and put into clinical practice. But basically Sal took what was a HEADS assessment, and for those who work in mental health, it basically is a conversation starter so that a professional can kickstart a conversation with a young person in a way that doesn't make them feel completely out of their depth, and makes it a safer conversation. So it starts with the home environment and then moves into education, I think it is, and then across into more complex conversations around alcohol and drugs and sexuality and suicidality. Anyway, Sal, working with Deb Rickwood, who was at Headspace at the time, basically said, let's put it onto an iPad, co-designed it, worked with both young people and clinicians. And the clinicians were, back in the day, back in 2010, I think 11, oh no, you don't want to do that. We need to have this conversation with the clinician, with the young person, and it's our therapeutic relationship, and it's much better to do it this way. Anyway, Sal and Deb was fantastic as well. They basically said, well, let's test it. Let's test the tech and let's test the therapeutic relationship. And she won the Prime Minister's Award back for the CRC. And essentially what she showed was that if you put it onto an iPad, and then Mary-Ann Webb went on to do it again, and similar results, young people were 9 to 10 times more likely to disclose an issue around sexuality or suicidality. Now, that is absolutely mind-boggling, that result, because what it means for a clinician is that the young person, when they come in and you've got real-time data in front of you, you can immediately start to unpack what those issues are for young people. On the Therapeutic Alliance, it didn't improve it, but it didn't take it away. So that whole argument of Therapeutic Alliance, it's just a misnomer. So that's the first one. The second one, and we did the co-design for Head to Health, which is the digital mental health gateway. If you don't know about it, jump on and have a look. It was co-designed with lived experience. Jackie Crow, who was commissioner at the time and has sadly passed away, led that co-design with the lived experience community, including people like Ingrid Ozols, who did, the startup of Blue Voices back when we did Beyond Blue, and Lynette Pearce, who supports the Consumer Network down in Tassie. Like, it was an incredible group of people. And what came out of that after, I think, 13 sessions of consultation across the country with lived experience and professionals and general community, was that the community wanted an avatar. And they wanted an avatar, and exactly to Michelle's point, they wanted the avatar because they wanted choice and control over how they access their information. So as they were becoming progressively unwell, they were less able to go through the fact sheets and the reams of information and, the complex websites that we somehow in the NGO sector think we have to create for people. And so they wanted this avatar. And the Department of Health were absolutely fabulous. They came to those co-design sessions, they sent their staff along, they wanted to understand it. And when we went back to present, we presented back to the department, but also to, I think, 13 CEOs of all of the NGOs. So it was, NGO of Lifeline, Beyond Blue, SANE, every NGO who supports people living with a lived experience. And we're presenting, and Jackie was presenting about this concept of an avatar. I remember it so clearly. Everyone was up in arms. Oh, it's not going to be as good as a real person. And we provide a service that's about compassion. And I could, for those who know Jackie, I could feel it tense up, and I could feel her getting more and more frustrated. And she eventually stood up and very, very gently put her hands on the table and said, we're not stupid. We know it's an avatar. We know it's not real. But what we're telling you is that sometimes we don't have the emotional capacity to pick up the phone and talk to someone. And we want this, and we want it to be simple to use. So again, hats off to the department, hats off to the Live community co-design that created it. The department funded it. It exists. It's about choice. So there's a telephone number, there's an avatar. If you want to search, you can search. And it's a collation of all of the resources that the not-for-profit sector and the NGO sector and the government have funded over the last however many years. So my hope for that is that it continues to evolve, and that they start to think about how they can grow that out and turn that into a much more interactive and proactive resource for people.
What a great resource. Thank you so much, Jane. And we might open it now to questions for the panel. So if you want to put questions into preferably the Q&A box, but the Q&A box or the chat. I might start with one, just picking up, particularly came through really strongly in Michelle and Jane's talks. I know Anthony's a really true believer in this as well, on the concept of co-design and designing with people with lived experience. And Jane, you very rightly said, this is not something that is new. It's been done for a long time. Maybe an observation I'd make is it's not new, but it's become a very overused term now, and it's not necessarily done well by people in all instances. So maybe just open that up for some comment from a research or practice perspective on what do you think are the key determinants of a good co-design process, and how do you truly include people with lived experience in the design of some of these tools? I don't know who wants to take that first. Maybe Anthony, if you want to take that first.
Yeah, I can say a few things, and I've seen it done very badly in conjunction with technology development in particular. So where in technology land we have sprints and scrums and processes that are about agile design, that are about speed and pace and efficiency, it really doesn't match all that well with co-design, which is to me about slow, taking time to understand the context and the experiences of people with lived experience, and including them in the process in a cyclical fashion. So iterating and coming back to them, and iterating and coming back to them, and importantly, giving them ownership over the design process and the outcomes. And that's so rarely done. It's so often a process of, well, we'll hear your views, we'll take it on board, we'll build it into our design, we'll call it co-design, and we'll launch this product. And that's basically it. So yeah, that's to me a key thing.
Yeah, fantastic. Michelle, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I have a kind of perspective on this, that I feel like often when people in the mental health sector in particular talk about co-design, we talk only about hearing from a small group of people who have particular types of experiences of mental health problems. And I think for me, the real opportunity around co-design is actually by bringing different stakeholders together to have a true process of co-creation and co-design. And that is also about contemplating the role that health professionals might play, that family and friends might play. How will whatever's being designed actually fit within the context of the person's life? Because I think we're often building for the individual rather than building for the individual that lives in a family or in a community or in a society that might interact with that piece of technology as well. But completely agree with Anthony. It's a really overused term. I've got a PhD student at the moment who's co-designing a podcast to reduce stigma. And when she was looking at the literature the other day, she was kind of throwing her hands up going, there is nothing on this concept that is so widely used. It's not that there's nothing, but it's that, it's perhaps used in a whole range of contexts where it's not appropriate as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Michelle. And Jane, I don't know if you want to add more on co-design and maybe some of those examples you spoke to as to what they do differently to make it successful.
Yeah, look, and I agree completely with Anthony and Michelle. I think Ingrid Ozols did put together a literature review. I don't know, Michelle, if you've got it, but you can reach out to Ing. I'm sure she'd be happy to share it. That was a few years ago now, but it'd be useful. So again, I reflect on, and I think Michelle's point is absolutely on the money. The single most powerful thing you can do is bring all of the players together. And I use the example of the Department of Health. The other one that has been absolutely fantastic has been the Department of Veterans Affairs. And I'm biased. I chair Open Arms, which is the Veterans and Veterans Families Counselling Service. But before I chaired that, I did the co-design of what was a co-created tool called High Res. It still exists, and it's as I have found out, it's been white labelled so others can use it. But and again, this is before co-design was something the government even thought about or considered. And they came to myself, Michelle, and the guys at Phoenix, so Dave Forbes' group, and said, would you create an app around resilience, basically? And I said, yep, absolutely happy to do it, as long as we can co-design it with the veteran and families community and the defence personnel and those who are going to use it. And they said, why would we do that? Why would we do that? And it was a very genuine question. Like, it was a very genuine question. And so we'd embarked on this engagement with them, and it really was an engagement to help them understand, and not in a patronising way, but help them understand how you actually co-design with policymakers so that you actually get a tool that is used by the community and, as Michelle pointed out, is used by families and does support behaviour. And what was fascinating about that, and again, you know, we were doing co-design workshops with young army guys at Enoggera, and, you know, chain of command was saying, you're not going to get anything out of these guys. They're not going to waste their time talking to you about what makes them feel mentally fit, healthy and well. And that was incredible. By the end of it, they were talking about using music for mood, using exercise for mood, playing the drum kit for mood. Like, it was just gold. And that was the army guys. And then next thing, we're in Canberra with the, you know, the top brass having a conversation about what would you do to you know, keep yourself mentally fit, healthy and well. And what came out of that was a really practical toolbox, because they all said, we're time poor and we want action-orientated, you know, action-orientated activities. And again, you know, hats off to Tracy Smart, who was at that stage leading their work around mental fitness. And that's permeated across Defence and Veterans Affairs. So there's not a single project that happens now. You know, the Open Arms one around peer-to-peer support, they did co-design up in Townsville. And again, to Michelle's point, you know, what's right in Townsville for peer-to-peer support in a clinical service is not right in Sydney, and Western Sydney is different to the North Shore, for example. So embedded into every part of the service delivery of Open Arms, and it's a clinical service, is co-design and peer networks to drive and change the service and to improve it constantly. And that's my final point. I'll finish. And Anthony's right. It's not co-design and then don't look at it ever again. It's co-design and evolutionise and constantly evolve so that you are creating, and this is like, get rid of the things that don't work. I feel like a broken record when I say this, but get rid of the things that don't work, that people aren't using. You know, if someone hasn't looked at your fact sheet for, you know, 20 years, take it off your website. It's of no use to anyone. So, you know, use it to improve and enhance your service and link it to outcomes, because if you can co-design, develop a service that's linked to outcomes and continue to measure that, then we're going to get a much better designed service. And if I come back to the Royal Commission report and Productivity Commission report, they've been saying what everyone's known forever, that the system's broken and that we have to reimagine it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jane. And I think it's such a good point. It's a really branding problem we have with co-design. That co-design isn't that one-off thing that you do in the design stage. It's co-creation, co-development, and it's just that kind of co-evolution of services ongoing with community. Bringing together, there's a couple of pieces in the chat which I'll bring together for the panel for comment. The first question was around how do we include families and young people who don't have internet connection or technology. And the kind of the second follow-on in the chat was talking about intelligent augmentation, kind of connecting some of the tech in with humans, either in a community engagement context or in a clinical context. I don't know if you want to comment on where you've seen examples of that it's not necessarily people reaching out to apps and websites, but how the technology is used as part of clinical practice or community engagement. If anybody wants to have a go at that one. Michelle?
Yeah, I can jump in on that one. I think, you know, and remember when I was doing my PhD, it was quite rare for clinicians to be using technology in their practice. And some people actually just started by sitting side by side with a young person and talking about what was on the computer screen or on their social media profile. Now, obviously now we're far more sophisticated, but I think it's really about skilling health professionals and clinical teams and peers up to be able to use the technology in a way that really helps to build that community. So I think, you know, there is still a big gap in terms of training and development for the sector. This was something we looked at quite a while back, and unfortunately very little has changed. I sort of think, you know, as much as there are now these really amazing, fantastic technologies, what we have seen, certainly in our work, is that sometimes some of the challenges that were coming up 10 years ago, 20 years ago are still there. And I think that skill building is going to be really essential to addressing that.
I could add, David, that that to me, you know, I personally really love exploring the edges of new technologies, and there's some questions about blockchain, about AI, and augmented intelligent systems, and we've talked about bots and all of that. And I think that it's really important to work at that end. But I'm also a big believer in low tech, and sometimes the simplest technologies work best, and they work longest. And this is why I continually come back to online forums, which was a 1980s, 1990s technology, but it works for a whole range of reasons that I think we've already discussed around the issue of protection and safety, and trust that's developed within a closed community, and also one that's away from Facebook, or from your friends and neighbors and family and networks that you don't want to have those kind of conversations with. So with all of these technologies, I kind of understand the reluctance for clinicians to be wielding out one app or another to try to solve a problem that they're working with someone closely and directly with, and have their methods that have been developed through their training over a long period of time. They're developing a relationship in a particular way. And I think sometimes technologies can assist in that process. But as I said, it's sometimes the simplest, phone for a quick, important connection, SMS and messaging, which is, we know is one of the most intimate, fast asynchronous responses that we can have, that opens up a level of connection that's really important. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. Jane, did you want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I second everything that Michelle and Anthony have said, and just two examples. I talked about HeatNet. I think that was, again, ahead of its time. It was hard technology in environments where technology was not available. I think back to the early days of Telstra, when they were providing digital access and mobile phones to Indigenous communities. That was back in the day when Darren Kane was there. I don't know if they're still doing that, but again, there are ways in which we can support vulnerable communities to gain access. And then the final one, which I think if people are interested in having a look at the work of Amanda Third, she did some amazing pieces of work with UNICEF around children's rights in a digital age. I think it's called The Report. Don't quote me on that. Michelle's much better at remembering names than I am. But, she went across to vulnerable countries and basically talked to young people and children about accessing technologies. And again, they're pretty incredible in terms of thinking about how they do it. And that report was amazing. And then finally, the Berkman Center out of Harvard, and to Anthony's point around dumb technologies, or whatever you want to call them, sort of not state of the art. But I remember being blown away seeing young people from Kenya, young people from South America, talking about how they had repurposed mobile phones to create opportunities for people to get drinking water, sanitation, just incredible innovation through not very smart tech. And again, I think that was probably 6 or 7 years ago. They write reports every year, so there'll be examples in that around innovation and technologies and accessibility.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We've probably got time for another question or two if you want to put any questions into the Q&A, and there's some good discussion going on in the chat as well. Just a question from me around COVID, and there's been a lot of discussion, obviously. But what challenges did you see that COVID brought? What problems did COVID exacerbate? You talked also, Jane, in your talk on some of the positive elements of connection during COVID. But just to open that up for discussion on the impacts of COVID, positive and negative, on mental health and digital inclusion. Who wants to go first on that? Maybe Michelle.
Yeah. So I think from the perspective of SANE's services, we had a 70% increase in people calling our helpline, and a really significant increase in people connecting with our online community. And that's been sustained over time. I think for our community, there were sort of a couple of different groups of people. There were people that were already facing a fair deal of isolation. So for them, COVID actually didn't have the same disruptive kind of effect that it had for other people in the community who were perhaps a bit more connected. I think for others, it sort of brought up kind of issues around trauma. So, if people had previously lost a job or experienced a sense of isolation that was kind of re-traumatizing. And then there was certainly a group of people for whom their mental health was impacted quite significantly. And what we saw was that there was a lack of PPE equipment or PPE available for people who were providing NDIS services, so psychosocial support to people living with mental health difficulties, which meant that for a really long time, a lot of people didn't have access to the connections that they would normally have from someone who might be in their home providing some additional support. Not everyone transitioned effectively to telehealth, and just a really quick example, I was speaking with a carer who was becoming quite concerned that their brother, who has an experience of schizophrenia, was getting worse, and he wasn't engaging with his treatment team, and telehealth was available. He had access to the technology, but in this man's words, how are they going to know whether I'm better or not? Because they can't see all of me. So they can't kind of see that perhaps the person isn't getting dressed during the day to head out, because that might be a sign that actually things are okay if they're able to get themselves out the door and to the appointment and those sorts of things. So I think there were definitely challenges, but also for some people a sense that, perhaps the rest of the world now understood how it feels to be isolated and disconnected from the people around you.
Well, thank you, Michelle. And Anthony, do you want to jump in? It'd be interesting to see whether there's any research emerging in this space as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who have been doing research in this space, deep into what has happened, and we're doing some of this work with SANE online forum data as well, to try to understand what happened over this period, and also in relation to the bushfires as well. We do know that there's huge spikes in outreach at this point, so we know that there's things happening internally and behind closed doors, but it's just really hard to access and hard to see. So the research will take a while to bubble to the surface. But the thing that I wanted to emphasize is that I think, as a country, we're not geared up very well to delivering services via technology, and we still have, a huge issue with disparity of outcomes that come from that. So there are just so many instances of so far reports that are perhaps a little bit anecdotal, but we're building evidence to show that people do hold off seeking support or services or medical intervention or any sort of intervention when they can't leave the house, when they can't actually go to a venue to talk to someone in person. And even the phone is sometimes a barrier to making those service connections happen. So I think that's a key thing that we have to think through as right across all sectors, but particularly those sectors that provide human and health services. And yeah, monitor how we can do that better. Really understand what the shift to digital only means, you know, beyond efficiency and beyond cost saving, and really, yeah, really work on that side of things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. A really good point. Thank you, Anthony. Jane, do you have anything further to add around COVID impacts and positive, negative, and learnings? Yeah.
Yeah, just and like saying, we saw absolute increases through our tele counselling services with Open Arms. So two anecdotal, which I thought were incredibly positive and creative, and in the veteran space. So RSL virtually took their yoga classes online and their cooking classes online, and the veteran community really did get behind that and utilised those. It's not to say there weren't people who didn't. It's certainly a vulnerable population group, but that was an example of a positive spin on it. And then the Swiss 8 guys, so Adrian Sutter, young guy, and they've been doing the Swiss 8 barbecue, and you know, previously would have brought people together to have a barbecue face to face. They did an online promotion and got people doing it sort of as a you know, join together. And I remember jumping on one of the, I can't remember what forum, one of the forums, and seeing, you know, people physically having barbecues, not connecting, but connecting via the technologies. So they're two positives. I think I've been really interested in the work that Total Brain have led, and they did the Workplace Wellbeing Index. And what they could clearly showcase in real time was the absolute spike in anxiety and depression across population groups. And again, you know, as Aaron Williams from Mindstar says, he's really focused on the positives, but he said, you know, if ever you want to create poor mental health, add uncertainty to it. And, you know, COVID-19 was just uncertain and out of control. We had no control over it. So the results from the US Wellbeing Index, we don't have one in Australia, which makes me slightly furious, but that clearly showed that, you know, there were declines in mental health and wellbeing, which is understandable in the context of what was going on. Of course, even the most robust of people are going to feel anxious about an unknown and uncertain, and that's certainly what that database shows.
Thank you, Jane. Plug for Mental Health and Wellbeing Index for us here in Australia. I think we're just about at time. There's some comments in the chat and questions about resources that we've referred to during the course of the discussion. So what we might do is just package up a number of those resources and links and send them out with the summary of the session and with the recording of the session. But I think I will now draw it to a close and just really want to thank again so much our speakers today, Anthony, Michelle, and Jane, for being so generous with your time and just amazing insights and so many, I thought, great, really practical examples of the tech that's out there and the work that's being done across the digital inclusion and mental health space. And thank you, Jane, in particular, for joining us from an airport. You did extremely well with your tech, given those circumstances. So thank you again to our speakers. Thank you, all of us, for joining us online and listening. A huge thank you to Ishtar and Anna in our ADIA team for organising today's meetup. They put in an incredible amount of preparation, and that's what makes all of this look so seamless when we end up having the meetup. So a huge thank you to Ishtar and Anna. Please, if you're not already, sign up to our ADIA newsletter to get information on future events. The website is at digitalinclusion.org.au. But again, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, and look forward to seeing you again soon.